more plants, and especially more forests. And we need to stop cutting down the rainforests and other large forests, because not only are we cutting them down, burning them, and releasing all that stored carbon into the atmosphere, but we're also interrupting their capacity to absorb more carbon dioxide. Does anybody know what percentage of global warming is due to tropical forest deforestation? In other words, the burning of the rainforests. Does anyone hazard a guess what percent of global warming? About 30%, actually. And if we could simply influence governments and other regulatory bodies to just to put out the fires, stop burning the rainforests, we could reduce global warming by 30% if we could simply stop that, as well as preserve for future generations all this molecular biodiversity, in which will be discovered, if we don't destroy it, the drugs of the future, the medicines of the future. So anyway, I'll get off that soapbox, but I think it's worth thinking about the importance of photosynthesis and plants for survival of life on Earth. And because plants can make organic compounds from sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water, they literally have energy to burn, right? I mean, they get it from the sun, they're unlimited. And they have energy to burn to make these compounds, because it costs energy to make these compounds, right? But because they have an unlimited source of energy in the sun, they make not only the molecules that are universal to life, but they also make a whole variety of secondary compounds, so-called secondary compounds, meaning they're not universally found in all living things. Only certain plants make them, sometimes only certain families of plants and this sort of thing. So they're obviously not essential for life, but what are they doing? Why do the plants bother to make all this molecular diversity and many of these molecules, many of which are biologically active in humans, in other animals, toxic or neuroactive or otherwise biologically active? So this is just a little joke. Basically explains photosynthesis. Sunlight is absorbed by the green pigment chlorophyll in plants and used to turn carbon dioxide and water into carbohydrates and oxygen. This is the basis of the food chain. And Frank says, I always wonder why people get fat and plants don't. Now I know. Plants are light eaters. Okay. And this diagram here, I sometimes show in my botanical medicines class, and my students have to memorize this. No, not really, but I threaten sometimes. But this just shows photosynthesis and its products in a little more diagrammatic way. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you've got your CO2 and water and sunlight. Photosynthesis leads into all these different chemical pathways, the lipids, the sugars, the phenolics, the alkaloids, the nitrogenous containing plant products, many of which are valuable drugs, many of which are psychedelic drugs. All these things, both structural and functional compounds like cellulose, like lactose, the purines, the molecules that go up to make the DNA. So you see these many branching types, and the greenish boxes, at least they're greenish on my screen, and surrounded by red borders, those are kind of the main classes of secondary products. And the blue ones are primary. The blue ones are the universal ones that we all have, but often we have to get them from plants, because we've lost the ability to make things like the aromatic amino acids, for example, which we need for protein. We can't make those anymore. We have to get those from plant sources now. And of course, one of those amino acids is tryptophan, and I was I think, raving about tryptophan yesterday, how it's the precursor to serotonin, our neurotransmitters, but also many of the drugs in nature that we curious primates find interesting. So we've got a few boxes of secondary compounds. We've got the nitrogen-containing ones in the lower right, lower left there, the alkaloids and the non-protein amino acids and the proteinaceous amino acids. We've got the volatile oils, the monoterpenes, most of the fragrances that we like that go into perfumes and cosmetics and things like that. That's where they come from, where they arise in nature. They're the terpenes. And there are some really interesting terpenes. I don't want to get too far into it, but for example, a lot of you are familiar with salvia, Savinorin A. That's a terpene, not an alkaloid. That's kind of an interesting characteristic for a terpene. And then the phenolic compounds, like the flavonoids, which have a variety of benefits. The flavonoids also are essentially accessory pigments in the plants that help with the light absorption or light protective. So if you live in a part of the world where the leaves turn in the fall, that's because chlorophyll is photodegraded, and when the sap stops rising, all that chlorophyll is destroyed, leaving the bright flavonoids, which are much more stable, the red and orange and purple flavonoids. Anyway, one could go on, but so an important point here. All these secondary metabolites, well, not all of them, but many of these secondary metabolites essentially serve the plant as a behavioral function. Plants communicate with their environment, other organisms in the environment. They regulate their whole ecological dance, if you will, through chemistry. Chemistry is the language of plants. And these secondary metabolites are messenger molecules. They interact with organisms in a variety of ways, and at every level of organization, from bacteria and fungi in the soil to herbivores like us that might want to nibble on these plants. And they're basically, so other plants, fungi, microorganisms, insects especially. The whole insect-plant symbiosis is just a whole other lecture, but plants and insects freely exchange chemistries and have this whole very complex molecular conversation going on with the insects, on which many of them depend for pollination. They also, of course, interact with herbivores, and herbivores includes humans. And in broad strokes, I yet have a stroke. Let's see. In broad strokes, the plants utilize these compounds for three huge areas. Defense, the idea that these things are repellents. They often don't taste very good to herbivores. They're often quite toxic, and they're basically a message of the plant to stay away. I just want to be left alone, and I don't taste very good, so leave me alone. Now, of course, we herbivores, and we primates especially, have undermined that relationship or changed or sort of repurposed it to our own benefits. Talk about that a bit later. Another big function of these plant secondary compounds is semiosis. Semiosis is signaling. Semiosis, these categories are not that separate. Like defense can be a form of semiosis, but semiosis, perhaps the pigments of a plant are brightly colored. They can be assigned to stay away, they can be assigned to please come closer. For example, brightly colored fruits, things like that. They want birds to eat them, so they eat the seeds and disperse the seeds. That's clearly a semiotic function, the color of the pigment. Also the fragrances, the color of flowers have a lot to do with attracting bees, and other pollinators. If you look at a flower in UV light, It looks quite different than it looks in bright daylight. There are UV active structures in it that to a lot of insects look essentially like a landing pad. That's because it is a landing pad. You know, it's like it homes right in. So plants are creative with signaling in all sorts of ways, and often that signaling, those associations, result in symbiosis. This is a key sort of concept of our relationship with plants. Symbiosis is a intimate, usually mutually beneficial living together of different species, usually two different species, but it can involve more than two as well. So symbiosis is a lot of what life is all about in this particular planetary biosphere. Without it, we would not be able to survive. We think often that we're separate from nature, but for example, as we were discussing yesterday, about 30% of your body mass is made up of bacteria. It's made up of microorganisms, and those microorganisms are by and large beneficial. They're the ones that inhabit your stomach, other parts of your body, and provide protection, immune stimulation, all this kind of thing. So that's a kind of symbiosis as well. So plants, that's another thing they do. They initiate symbiosis. And, you know, the sort of 19th century older view of evolution and natural selection was all about competition. It was about things fighting each other, you know, for space, for nutrients, for other kinds of resources. And competition certainly goes on, but now we know the relationship is much more complex. It's more about symbiosis. It's about cooperation and collaboration. Species work together to optimize the conditions for everybody. Something that we might want to pay attention to. Maybe they're onto something. So here's a bee pollinating a flower, and this is a good example of both semiosis and symbiosis. The plant sends out various cues to attract the bee to the flower, fragrances, color, etc. And knowing that that the bee also knows somehow that there is nectar in these flowers to be gathered, turned into honey. So they come, and in the process of fulfilling their own needs, they get covered with pollen. Then they fly to the next flower and pollinate it. Pretty simple. When it comes to humans, I kind of like this painting by, who is it by? Arcimboldi in the 18th century. And this, I call this "You Are What You Eat." This is just a picture of a human with all the nutritional plants, the vegetables and so on that they might consume. And it's really true that, you know, we are, in fact, what we eat. And I think the plants that we eat, obviously, are also full of these secondary compounds, all kinds of things, which we value very much. You know, the nutrients, the flavonoids, the antioxidants, pigments like anthocyanins, such as you find in purple corn, or you know, superfoods like acai. These things are very good for you. They're good for the immune system. They're strong antioxidants. They help the metabolism, and so, you know, we get those, not only nutrients, of course, nutrients as well, lipids, proteins, fats, sugars, all that. So we evolved, primates evolved, everything evolved in a chemical ecology. I like to talk about chemical ecologies, because if you think about it, you can think of the whole ecosphere in terms of a chemical system. Chemicals floating around, all these messenger molecules regulating the ecosystem, and some of them regulating our own behavior, because we're also immersed in this system. And when we were before civilization, before we invented agriculture, actually, we were hunter-gatherers, we were foragers, and so we were out in the environment looking for for foods, for games, whatever we could find. And we were quite omnivorous. What story? Yeah. For all this, both plants and animals. But at some point, we understood, or we maybe accidentally, maybe deliberately noticed that, you know, all those foods we were throwing away in the midden pile, in the garbage pile, guess what? Plants were sprouting up out of those garbage piles. So then we made the connection that, you know, we could control this. So essentially we invented agriculture. We found out how to propagate plants and how to grow our own food. And that just led to a whole slew of incredible changes. I mean, this was some kind of an evolutionary leap, if you will, that so far no other primate or nothing else on the planet has achieved. We figured out how to grow plants. So then we started, that made possible to live in sedentary villages that eventually became cities. And we could live in villages. We didn't have to forage and go with the seasons and all that. We could have established villages. So then out of that, we could get division of labor, we could get specialization. Certain people became artists, certain people became administrators, doctors, all the thing. And we could invent and create all of these institutions and human areas of activity, I guess you could say, that we think of as uniquely human. You know, the arts, the sciences, law, poetry, everything like that, medicine. And medicine is also kind of an interesting case because medicine is the deliberate application of the secondary compounds in plants. It all started with medicinal plants. And somehow, probably through trial and error and experimentation, I'm sure a lot of mistakes were made, but we discovered the therapeutic properties of medicinal plants, and we invented pharmacology. And some people have speculated that before agriculture, when we were in a nomadic state, we didn't really have to have medicine as we understand it now, because we foraged on such a vast variety of molecular diversity. Our diets were partly full of toxins and medicinal plants, medicinal molecules, which we could well metabolize and deal with, and those may have provided a veneer of protection from some of the diseases. But then when we formed these sedentary villages, sedentary associations of humans, for one thing, hygiene in these places wasn't so great. So we brought the pathogenic organisms closer together, and we became at risk for higher levels of disease. So then we started reintroducing these toxic plants from the wild into our food chain. They were perceived to be helpful to change the disease. So the pharmacology sort of shifted from just unconscious behavior, part of our feeding strategy, to serious a science, essentially, a nascent science, learning how to cultivate these medicinal plants. Well, of course, similar things went on with the food plants. We began to select food plants for characteristics that we liked, you know, that were appealing. So better taste, less bitterness. This was partly bitterness. Most people don't like bitterness, they like sweet things. So we actually bred our food plants to be less bitter. And in that way, we bred out many of the beneficial compounds in them. So we had to substitute those. And we selected for, you know, traits that we like, color, size of fruit, this kind of thing. And so we modified the plants in our environment as seriously as the plants impacted us, because we depended on them for food and medicines, but it was a two-way street. And essentially, without having genetic engineering and all those things that we have now, which we can do even more sophisticated things, and sometimes maybe dubious things, like introducing shark's genes into broccoli and things like that. Maybe that's okay, I don't know. But anyway, we created the first GMOs through just selective breeding. Our food plants evolved into creatures of agriculture. They did fine in an agricultural situation as long as there was somebody to look after them and cultivate them and keep them watered and so on. So then you got monstrosities like, you know, this Brussels sprouts, for example. This thing could not survive in nature. It would never arise in nature and wouldn't make it in this configuration. But it works. It's a genetically engineered plant. It just wasn't done by artificial genetic engineering. Similarly with our cannabis plant, as an example of medicinal plants, I don't have to tell this crowd how much genetic engineering has gone on with cannabis just in the 20th century. Same was true back then. It's been recognized as a medicinal plant for 10,000 years, and people have been mucking with its genome, breeding for traits they like, high oil content in the seeds, or, you know, good fiber quality, or more different spectrums of cannabinoids. So all the cannabis species that we know really arose from a single common ancestor, which wasn't that interesting or useful, but we worked with it for 10,000 years, and now we see what a useful plant it is. Very unusual plant in that we can get fiber, we can get food, and we can get drugs from it. A multi-purpose plant. And it was a two-way street. So we impacted the plants, but these secondary compounds also impacted us. They had an effect on our evolution, our gene expression, our phenotype. The phenotype being the expressed result of the genotype, the genetic complement. So it kind of starts here. Secondary compounds in plants, naturally occurring toxins, human dietary exposure, and then on the left, the direct effects on the genotype. Behaviors, a behavioral response that we develop to recognize plants, to avoid them if they're toxic. So sort of repulsion mechanisms, vomiting, diarrhea, all those kind of responses are a way of getting rid of the toxins. And we also figured out, so we invented ways of behavioral detoxification, like what we do with cassava. If you know cassava, it's a main starchy staple of the food chain in the tropics, but in a lot of areas of the tropics, it's toxic. It contains hydrocyanic acid. So you have to put it through a long process of leaching and then making flour out of it to get rid of that toxin, and it's a perfectly good food. So we developed some very sophisticated ways of detoxifying both plants, food plants and medicinal plants. And we developed our own physiological detoxification mechanisms. We have in our liver, we have in the GI system, we have bacteria, which have a lot to do with breaking down these glycosides and other things that are in plants. Glycosides are compounds that are conjugated with sugars, and they're often not that bioavailable, but if you break them down, then they become absorbable. And also we have this thing called the cytochrome P450 systems, which are basically liver localized enzymes that are inducible. So this is what I mean when I say everyone is their own chemical ecology, and you're immersed in a chemical ecology. Everyone is a biochemical individual, and that depends on the foods you eat and the drugs you take and the other chemicals that you're exposed to in the environment. So we adapt to those. We have these really plastic, responsive enzyme systems. That's why, for example, this is not cytochrome, but a good example is alcohol. One can become quite accustomed to alcohol. And so you can drink and drink and drink, and the enzymes that detoxify it in your system, in this case alcohol dehydrogenase, is induced. So you may not drink that much. So a couple of beers will put you under the table. Meantime, your buddy can sit there all night and drink because he drinks a lot or she drinks a lot. You know, she's used to it. Her body is biochemically adapted to it. I don't necessarily advocate that, but that's an idea. That's an idea of biochemical adaptation. You know, we can do that. So, and then on the genotype side, there are also, these secondary compounds also directly affect your genotype, your DNA and your genetic makeup. There is actually feedback mechanisms. We now know that it's a two-way street, that influences on the environment can feed back on the genome and affect gene expression. It's not understood to be one way anymore. And so molecular changes in these gene products can, for example, induce enzymes, as I just illustrated, and stimulate hormone production and stimulate a lot of processes that have to do with maintaining a chemical homeostasis, a chemical balance with your chemical ecology. And so then these things come together to lead to, it says, initiated variations in diverse metabolic processes lead to modifications in gene disease susceptibility, changes in individual and group biological fitness, the biochemical individuality thing, and eventually changes in gene frequency, changes in the occurrence of genes, the abundance of genes, which drives some of the natural selection process. So modifications in disease susceptibility, easy example to think about. If you have a tribe in one valley that's feeding on a particular plant which happens to have immune stimulating processes, properties, and many of them do, and the tribe the next valley over, maybe that plant doesn't occur there. So population that feeds on the immune plant will have a certain advantage. They will have lower rates of disease simply because of this dietary factor. And it goes on and on. I might mention there's an interesting book out by a guy named Tony Wright, who's got a whole theory of neural evolution based on our shift from eating primarily fruits to moving out of the arboreal environment into the Serengeti plain initially, and how the shift of diet affected the evolution of the brain. I think it's called Return to the Brain of Eden. Very interesting idea, anyway. So, neural evolution. This is a timeline